I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me to participate in this meeting in the next couple of days. I started about 10 years ago along a process of developing a medical device. And 10 years later, I can say I'm older and perhaps a little wiser. And I've been asked many times by people whether knowing now what I know, would I go through the process again? And I usually say yes. It's been challenging, it's been interesting, and I've enjoyed it to a large extent. My perspective on this discussion is as a physician and as a professor at a university, so it's quite different from Frank's, although I certainly understand a great deal of the messages that he was giving you. My background is as a gynecologist with a subspecialty training in urogynecology, which I did in the University of Southern California. Graduated from that program in 1989 and started work at Dalhousie in 1990. The patient population of my specialty is women who, and for the most part, they're women who are experiencing urinary incontinence or bladder leaking. And most urogynecologists are surgeons, so they like to be in the operating room doing procedures. And I like to do that too, but I also early on developed an interest in conservative management of these problems. And one of the most common and effective conservative managements is to use pessaries, and I'll explain a bit more about those devices in a minute. I think the challenge that the people in this room face and the universities face is that there's a high rate of failure of commercial translation efforts. It's well known that 1 in 10 startup companies actually succeed in developing a product and getting it to a point where it's commercially available. So we have to ask ourselves what happened to those other 9 companies along the way, what led to the failure. And there are a lot of factors which influence that success. Sometimes it's just a matter of the idea or the device that they were hoping to produce was not good and was not likely to be well accepted by the community. Any of you who've watched that popular program on television, Dragon's Den, will know that there are all kinds of crazy ideas out there, some of which do get to commercial fruition, but many do not. But I think the other big reason is just that the lack of resources that are available to the innovators. And that's where I can certainly speak from experience that there are many challenges when you are not a business person and you would like to develop an idea. The path is not clear and the resources are difficult to find, and that's partly why it took me 10 years to get where we got to. And I think that this is a place where the universities can play a key role in bringing together the resources that will make this process much more smooth and effective for people. Before I talk a bit about my own experience, I'd like to talk a bit about what not to do. This is a cautionary tale. In order to talk about it, I have to just tell you a bit about anatomy. And I guess we don't have a pointer here. Oh, there is a pointer, is there? Oh, yeah. Does that work? Oh, yeah. So when women have urinary incontinence, the problem is that when they cough, sneeze, or laugh, they leak urine from the bladder. And the big problem is the urethra at the base of the bladder is not strong enough to keep the urine in. This happens often as a consequence of childbirth. Early on in my clinical experience, I worked with a device called the incontinence ring. You see it here on the left. And this device is placed in the vagina. This is a side view of the pelvis. The uterus is here, the bladder and urethra here. And the knob on that device supports the urethra and stops the leaking. Now, that worked well for a number of women, but it also had its limitations. There were some women where we felt something stronger was needed. And so I approached an architect friend of mine who, and this is an example of you use the resources available to you. I probably should have gone to an engineer or somebody else, but the architect drew the pictures for me, and I sent those pictures on to one of the principal manufacturer of pessaries in the U.S. at the time, and I can put their name up here because they're not in business anymore. About a month after I sent that design to the manufacturer, I got a call from the CEO who said, "Dr. Farrell, we think this is a great product. We really want to do something with this." And so I thought, well, that's great. We're going to start working together and we'll see what happens. We'll do clinical trials, all those good things. About 3 months later, they released their new product, which if you see this pessary right here was one that they had already in production. And what they did is they took that pessary and put a knob on it on the side, which was a variation of the invention that I had come up with. They also put knobs on a bunch of other pessaries that hadn't had them before. And they immediately produced those. There were no clinical trials. There certainly was no remuneration for me or any recognition for that matter. In fact, there was even a patent applied for and issued in the name of somebody else. So I learned my lesson, and the next time I came up with a great idea, I didn't go to that company to ask for help, obviously. But the question is, how do you take an idea, in this case modeled out of plasticine that I stole from my daughter's play box, and turn it into a final product that is on the market and accessible to the consumer, which you see in the bottom right-hand side. It's not an easy process. As Frank mentioned, having the idea is the easiest part of the process. Anybody can have a great idea, but as soon as you have that great idea, then you've got to start answering a lot of questions. How do I protect that idea? I have to have intellectual property protection. If I don't, nobody's going to invest in my idea. Where do I go for prototyping and manufacturing? There's not a list of people out there you can just go to and say, "I'd like to make this device. Can you help me?" Will the authorities approve my product? How do I go through the regulatory process? And then I want this to be appealing to the consumer. The bottom line is, unless you can sell your product at the end of the day, you might as well not start right now. So what do you call it? What does it look like? And where does the money come from to do this? I think that looking at the university setting, 10 years ago when I started, Dalhousie had a rudimentary office of technology incubation, which really couldn't offer me much at all. And so at that time, I launched out on my own. Looking at the University of Western Ontario's faculty agreement, we see that things have changed considerably. They very clearly recognize the intellectual property rights of their faculty, and they have a policy called the inventor-owned intellectual property rights. And what that allows is that the faculty member has the option of going it alone. They can go and they can develop the product themselves, or they can collaborate with the university. The only requirement is that if you come up with a new idea, you must at least make the university aware of it and have discussions with them about collaboration. I think that the better route, and I'll give you my reasons why, is to contract with the university, presuming that the university has the resources that are necessary, and then go on to down that road of development. And that can be, you can contract with the university and simply sell them or transfer your rights to them for some kind of remuneration or something down the road, or you could collaborate with them, which I think is probably the better route. If you turn over your invention, make sure that there's a clause in the contract that says they don't simply put it on the shelf. Now, the steps from conceptualization to realization there are a lot of them. Funding is key. Without money, you cannot do a lot of the things you need to do. You can't apply for patents. You can't find a manufacturer. You can't develop prototypes and do clinical trials. And many medical devices now require some kind of clinical trialing. It was mentioned earlier that FDA has increased its stringency of its regulatory requirements. You have to protect your intellectual property. This is particularly important to venture capital investors. They want to know that nobody's going to take over your product or produce a substitute for it. And your intellectual property protection is most important in the biggest market area. So in North America, that would be in the United States. You need a US patent, and that's what you should go for first. Once you develop the prototype, then you have to test it. Now, obviously, this varies from the different types of medical devices, and the more invasive, the more testing is going to be required. Clinical trials will need to be done. It was suggested earlier that there are two different processes for the US. The FDA 510K process was fairly simple in that if there was a predicate device on the market in the US that you could convince the FDA was very similar to your product, then you would not have to submit a lot of clinical data in order to allow you to release the product. And in my area of specialty, we see a lot of companies producing mesh products that are used for pelvic surgery that have not had any clinical testing whatsoever. But the FDA is raising that bar, and they're making it more like you were introducing a product for the first time, which is a much more lengthy and involved process. Once you've proven that it works, then you have to design it and package it so that it's going to be, again, it's going to be attractive to the consumer. If it's a consumer product, it's going to be attractive to the healthcare professionals, or convincing at least to healthcare professionals if it's a product for their use. And you have to find distribution channels to finally market the product, which is probably the most expensive part of the whole process. We, just quickly going through the steps, because we didn't have much help, we early on incorporated a company called EastMed to help develop the product. You need mentorship. I'm not a businessman, but one of my friends, unfortunately for him, was a businessman, and he'd retired early and thought he was going to live happily ever after paddling around the shores of Nova Scotia, until he agreed to help me with this project, and that was 10 years ago, and he's still sitting in the office half the week helping me. So, but you do need help in some form, some knowledge. And I readily acknowledge what Frank was saying about don't try to do the business part of it. You have to find money. We found money initially from friends, from family, from ourselves, and you need some of that. You need some to get through the early stages of development of your product. If you can't find that, you won't be going very far. We found a patent lawyer. Believe it or not, back 10 years ago, it wasn't that easy to find someone who could do a patent application for you. We finally found one. We made our application to the patent office in Canada. We did the Canadian application first because it was easier and cheaper. Succeeded in getting a Canadian patent, and then years later, when we had more money, we went to the US process, which cost twice as much or more to get a patent. You have to find somebody to manufacture your product. If you're lucky and Frank comes along and he likes your product, then he'll take care of that side of it. But if you just come up with an idea of your own and you don't know who can do it for you, then you have to find a manufacturer, and they will be the ones who will help you develop the final version of the product and develop prototypes and help you then go on to testing them. And once you have a prototype, then you have to do the clinical trials. It took 2 years for us to do the clinical trial. There were ethics issues at our university because they felt it was a conflict of interest for me to develop a product and then test it, because it would have commercial viability, they had concerns. So all they would allow us to do was a pilot project. We enrolled 32 women and followed them over a year. We successfully fitted 66% of those women with the Arresta pessary, and of those 66%, 76 of those went on to use it for 12 months. We're happy with it and continued using it afterwards. So we felt that that was a good endorsement of the product. So then, after you've done that, then you need regulatory approval. In Canada, it's relatively straightforward. In the US, as you've heard repeatedly, it's not. You're going to need regulatory advice, and we found a company called CanReg in Hamilton, which has done a great deal of work for us in helping us get through the regulations. And finally, you need some real money. I mean, up to a certain point, you can get by with, I think we raised about $200,000 from friends and family and some of those angel investors that were mentioned earlier. But that's not enough to fully develop a product, market it, and sell it. We were lucky to interest two companies, the Nova Corp, which is an incubation firm in Nova Scotia, and the Business Development Bank of Canada, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with. And together they gave us $3 million, which certainly went a long way to develop the product. So one of the people we had as a consultant early on was our CFO, Henry Taylor, who's a very down-to-earth, basic kind of guy. Most accountants seem to be like that. And he said, he told me early on, Scott, there's one rule in business, is the golden rule of business investment. And it's not like the golden rule that you know about in the Bible. The golden rule of business investment is that he who has the gold makes the rules. And you'll find that out very quickly. When it comes time to put $3 million into your idea, don't expect that they're going to give it to you and let you hold on to 90% of the company. As Frank said, your idea is worth 1%. Their money is worth the rest of it. So, and they're going to be very interested in a lot of things. You're going to have to prove to them that there's a market for this product that's big enough to generate income, that the competition in that market is not so strong that you can't enter it, that you're going to be able to carve out a portion of that market, which is sizable enough, and you have to have a strategy for doing that. You can't just say, oh, we've got a great product, people will love it. You've got to be able to convince them that, in fact, you can do that. And they will be very interested in your intellectual property protection, particularly in the areas where they expect the most income to come from. So again, in North America, the United States, make sure you have a US patent before you go to a venture capitalist. They aren't going to be interested otherwise. And how strong is that protection? We have protection in North America, in the United Kingdom, in Europe, in Australia, in Japan. But there are many countries where we don't have any protection. And then finally, can you achieve regulatory approval? Without that, you can't manufacture a medical product. You have to then think about appealing to the consumer. You have to have a logo, you have to have a design for your packaging, and all of that, again, depends on the product, but if it's a consumer product, that's all critical to the success. And distribution channels are also critical. In our case, we had a medical product that was a prescription as well as over-the-counter. And so we were able to, we had to go to healthcare professionals to educate them about it. We developed an e-commerce website, and we also had to go to pharmacies to get them to stock the product on their shelves. So all of these channels had to be developed. So I think in closing remarks, the opportunity for the university is huge. Nobody does anything without some kind of motivation. And I think the motivation of the university to have their professors, their employees have successful technical innovations is multiple. They're altruistic organizations. They want to see the public good served. They also, if they can trumpet the successes of their faculty in developing technical devices which are worldwide recognized. That's a big kudo for the university. And they also would look at the financial gain aspect of it, and hopefully some of these products would be successful and bring money back. If they want to encourage innovation within their confines, then the rights to the intellectual property are key. That was the first thing I looked at when I developed this product, and I went and looked at the Dalhousie regulations, and they stated clearly that the intellectual property was mine. There are many universities in the US and Canada where faculty's intellectual property is claimed by the university, and that's going to just stultify any innovation. And then you have to establish the resources to facilitate the process of commercialization. And you got a bit of a sense from Frank that there can be a lot of frustration there when people are not well informed about how the whole process works. So I would suggest that I could just call it the Office of Technical Translation. I'm sure there are lots of different names for it. But I think that there are a number of things that can be done at a university level which will facilitate the whole process. Develop models of collaborative agreements for your faculty so that you very easily they can see how they're going to participate and benefit from their innovation. Help to fund those early stage activities. The universities have prestige, they have resources, they should be able to muster the funds, which isn't, and it's usually not a large amount of money, to get over some of the major hurdles at the beginning, to apply for patents and successfully achieve those, to develop a prototype, to do clinical testing, to seek regulatory approval, and to develop a business plan. You can bring together those resources quite easily in a room, as someone said, a round table, and move things along very quickly. Provide mentoring to your faculty about the intellectual property process. Bring in business expertise and give them their due and respect their perspective on things, to develop a business plan. Bring in regulatory expertise. That's very sophisticated. That's not a simple thing. There are people who spend their whole day working out how to best approach the FDA, how to get ISO certification. You need that expertise. And liaise with the venture capital community. You've heard about how reluctant the venture capital community is to invest money. Well, the university could maybe give them a little more assurance by one means or another that they might be more inclined to start earlier into the process. Come up with fair agreements that will satisfy the venture capital community and exit strategies which they'll be happy with. That's all I have to say. Thanks very much.